announce this before we start with the colloquium today by quite a few people. We are not a purple state. It's been officially announced that we are a blue state. Around 10 or 11 years ago, seems a long time back, one of the very first papers that I read in the domain of consumer behavior was by none other than our speaker for today. And at that time, I was still a first-year doctoral student at Penn State. And one of the first things that struck me when I read this paper, when I was taking my first consumer behavior seminar, and one of the first papers that I read was on negative emotions, and I just remember being completely fascinated by it. And at that time, when I finished reading that paper, I just was so humbled by the quality of scholarship, the rigor of the scholarship of the author. But it was not just the rigor of the scholarship that was so appealing and so impressive, it was also the lucidity of writing. And especially as a first-year doctoral student, I just remember being completely amazed by that and saying, wow, such complex ideas, such great theoretical work, but yet being expressed in a way that even an idiot like me could actually comprehend it after a couple of reads. And so it's both a pleasure and an honor to have Dr. Mary Frances Luce today as an invited speaker to the Colloquium series. Many of you saw the handout, the one that I sent out on the listserv. Mary Fran is a professor at Junck, the Fuqua School of Business, Department of Marketing. And she is one of the nation's leading experts on negative emotions, particularly looking at it in terms of how it affects decision making in the domain of consumer behavior as well as medical decision making. She is published in just about every top tier journal, most of those in the business domain, including the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing Research, Marketing Science, Marketing Letters, Journal of Experimental Psychology, just about every single top tier journal. And she also teaches courses on healthcare marketing as well as consumer behavior. Over the last 3 years, there's been a special connection with our school because most of our students have been gaining from her incredible expertise and knowledge. They've been taking her classes in consumer behavior, and I know that at least 4 of you from this very semester are sitting here. Mary Fran's research has also been funded by the National Science Foundation and the Marketing Science Institute. In addition to all these journal articles, just about every one of which has been published in a top-tier journal. She's also authored a very important book with Professors Jim Beckman and John Payne on emotional decisions. So we have a true leader in consumer behavior, and today she's going to be talking to us about some of her recent work on the negative effects of Locus of Control, and she's examining this within the context of HIV. So without much further ado, a very warm welcome to you.
Oh, thank you. So as she said, this is recent work. We have a couple of experiments done. We're still collecting data. Honestly, we're still working through the story a little, so any suggestions, anywhere it doesn't make any sense, let me know. Or should I say in places or it doesn't make sense, let me know. So what I'm going to talk about today is measured locus of control and how that influences people's intentions. And what we have here is pretty much measured intentions, not behaviors, I'll be honest. And intentions to engage in protective behaviors in the context of HIV, which we're interested in because we think it's important. We're interested in because we're using college student subjects. And actually, we have one study with college students and one without, with an internet sample. But something they worry about is something that seems relevant. And the reason that we got to this, where this research started, is with Adriana Samper, who is I believe, third-year PhD student at Fuqua, a really excellent student, and also Debu Purohit, my colleague on the marketing faculty at Fuqua. And Debu and Adriana and I, a couple years ago, started doing some work with a place called Active Health that's essentially an employee wellness type organization. They claim they're not a wellness organization. I don't know. Whenever we say they're wellness, they say, no, we're different, but I can't figure out how they're different, so I'll just say they're wellness. So they have these agreements with companies. This is actually came out of someone who worked at Duke Med School, but it's spun off somewhat. They get these contracts with companies, and they give the employees of the company health assessments. They'll even take a blood draw and give pretty detailed health assessments, and then education. And essentially what they're trying to do is make people make better health decisions, reduce their own health risks. So they'll say we can figure out, who's at risk for diabetes and try to get them to, eat better or do whatever really they need to do next to most mitigate their risks. And so this is a really good context for looking at individual differences, because they have this ability to send out even tailored samples of things to the employees. So we started playing around with a bunch of different individual differences: health, esteem, locus of control. So that was sort of the genesis for it, was this pretty much marketing approach, marketing in terms of market segmentation approach to trying to communicate with people about diseases. And that created this interest on our part in an interest in locus of control as a potential segmentation variable, or a variable that can be measured and then used to address health risks. And you'll see we're not there yet. We're not yet to the part where we say, okay, we think that you should measure health locus of control and then tailor these, tailor your communications appropriately, partly because when we did some lab testing, we started to find what we thought were some pretty interesting nuances in terms of how health locus of control seems to work. So that's where we are. So I'm going to just start by, for a few slides, just kind of laying out the concepts we're interested in here. So the two experiments I'll show you are both in the context of HIV. With most of these sorts of health communication contexts, one, the thing we want, so one thing that's really important is prevention, and an important step is also often risk, right? Perceived risk or vulnerability. So standard views, the health belief model, which has been used, 600 times, it's probably a low estimate, has as one very important variable vulnerability, right? If I don't think I can get a disease at all, if I have no vulnerability, I'm probably not going to protect myself against it, right? So it makes good sense that increased vulnerability, and what I'll call that really self-risk, my own risk, can drive prevention. Okay, that sounds logical. It's certainly often supported, makes sense. One nuance already, and we've got some kind of funny relationships, and a lot of non-relationships with self-risk, and I think the second side kind of tells us why. An alternative view, or a nuance maybe on that view, is that, well, this relationship is reciprocal. The relationship between vulnerability or self-risk and prevention is reciprocal. So, for instance, if I am a college student who always engages in prevention, if I always use condoms, right, I prevent HIV risk or mitigate it, I'm actually going to have I ought to have lower vulnerability, right? So when you measure things cross-sectionally, which we do, which most of these studies do, you might expect the health belief model relationship that if I perceive more risk, I'm going to intend more prevention. But you might not get that relationship as well, because beliefs about prevention also drive beliefs about risk, right? So there's a bi-directional causality, and I think partly what we're looking at in these studies is that other side, this other side of the relationship that I say, well, prevention reduces risks. So what I think about prevention is going to have a dampening or a mitigating view on risk, or impact on risk. So, these guys make the nice point in the Psych Bulletin article, Gerard et al. Make the nice point that, well, where you really should see vulnerability leading to prevention is longitudinally over time. So I'm vulnerable now, then it motivates me to prevent, then I'm vulnerable then I'm less vulnerable later, but it's hard to get that cross-sectionally. All right. The other thing that we noted early on, we didn't think about this up front when we started thinking about the effects of internal health locus of control, and then we were locus of control. And then as we talked about it, we started realizing, well, there's different types of diseases, and I think, again, this will be really important when I show you the manipulations we cross with locus of control in our two experiments. But some diseases, if you think about a disease like breast cancer, you might be worried about family history, and knowing friends who have it may make you more worried about it, but really, risk is a relatively individual thing, right? So you can calculate a Gale score model of your own individual risk, and it's about your own family history, your own behaviors, etc. But for lots of diseases like HIV, others' risks are really important too. So what I assume or think about other people out there could have an impact on, my own, what I'm going to get to is an impact on my own prevention intentions. But, so how do you think about others' risks? Certainly they're important in this kind of context. Well, one thing is they can be a relative benchmark for self-risk. And we tend to know how that goes. That is how much, if you compare self and other risks on average, what's the relationship you find? Are they equal on average because it all washes out? No, we always think we're at less risk, right? There's a general tendency, not 100% of the time, but there's a general tendency to engage in unrealistic optimism, to when you think about others' risks, think that they're higher. So we know that, and we keep looking for that in the data, but I don't think that's our story here. But for contagious diseases, you might really want to think about others' behavior if you're thinking about your own risks. So if others prevent, then something, TB or HIV or anything like that. If others are preventing, then I'm protected, right? That's the sort of, some people think this about, like vaccinations. What's really ideal for any one individual is everybody else gets the vaccination, and then there's herd immunity, and then you don't have to have the risk, right? So if others prevent, I am protected. What we're going to be worried about here is this tendency also to think, well, if I prevent, others prevent, right? To think you're too protected. So I think you can probably start to see where I'm going with this. To have this bias towards thinking you're more protected than you are, and that factors that make you feel actually be more protected, like your own good behaviors, might, in some situations, through a false consensus type mechanism. So false consensus type mechanism is simply this idea that we all think other people are more like us than really objectively they tend to be. So through this kind of mechanism, my own prevention might make me think others prevent, might make me think I'm more protective. So it's kind of stepping back now. More generally, for contagious diseases like the ones I'm going to tell you about that were the context for our experiments, changes in others' risk have implications for self-risk. All right. And then finally, the other construct we're interested in here is this idea of control. So what does it mean to think a risk is controllable, right? And again, we see two different sides to this story. Well, one thing, one aspect of the conventional wisdom, or one way to think about it, which I think is generally the conventional wisdom, is that control is good, right? Belief in control is good. Learned helplessness is bad. It's good to believe you're in control. So internal health locus of control is in general associated with preventive health behaviors. Okay? So if I think health risks are controllable by me, I'm more likely to try to quit smoking or to agree to engage in prevention. Not always, sometimes the relationship's flat, but generally it has a positive relationship. And again, going back to the more general models, such as the health belief model, a notion of efficacy, belief in my own ability to succeed, or self-efficacy is generally assumed to increase prevention, generally assumed to be important for adaptive health behavior. So control is good, right? I like control, that's a good thing, it should be good. But we're partly in our experiments looking at what we think is sort of the downside of control, related to the downside of prevention, this idea that, well, what if feelings of control reduce your belief in the threat, right? So, and again, anticipating the result we got that we thought was kind of counterintuitive, if I think HIV risk is controllable and I think I'm preventing it, then, if I am caused to extend that belief, I might, in the end, say, well, everybody else is preventing it too, and it's controllable in it anyway, and why would anybody get it if it wasn't, if it's so controllable, so I don't really actually need to worry about it. So what if feelings of control also reduce belief in threat? So, more specifically, I'm going to talk about two experiments today that both look at or both identify what we think is a downside or a backlash for internal health locus of control. And I'm not saying like we should all be, external locus of control and that internal locus of control is a bad thing, but I'm just showing you a mechanism whereby it ends up reducing intentions to prevent. So the context for both studies is HIV risk. And what Adriana did was she created a nice pamphlet, about a one-page pamphlet, printed it out in color, basically taking stuff from the CDC website. So basically taking information, relatively scary, but not, not overblown, information, that just talks about college students being at risk for HIV, talks about, HIV is not a good thing, and talks about prevention, so just kind of a normal health communication. And then we measure internal health locus of control. And we find in a couple of contexts some what we think are ironic effects of internal health locus of control, which is that internal health locus of control in some situations causes people to expect others to be like them. And then we think, and we don't have a lot of direct process evidence on this next step, and then we think to say, well, others are protecting themselves, right? Why would these people get HIV? Why would a potential partner choose to get HIV? It's controllable. Others are going to control their risk, so I actually don't need to protect myself so much. It's not as big of a deal. And we use two distinct manipulations to investigate what I'm going to call a self versus other focus view. One is mortality salience. So in study one, our manipulation is of mortality salience, because we know that one of the things that mortality salience seems to do is cause people to sort of extend their worldviews to others. But if you've read the mortality salience literature, or even like started to look at it, you'll see mortality salience appears to do about 200 different things in the like 800 studies out there. So, do we know that that's the specific mortality salience mechanism? No, we don't. So to try to get some more information on the process, what we did in experiment 2 is we used a very different manipulation, and we very directly said to people, read this pamphlet and think about yourself, which we think is really a baseline type manipulation. People generally don't need to be told to think about themselves. It's sort of like they do, right? Egocentric biases are generally out there. Or we said, read this pamphlet thinking about the average individual. Read it from the perspective of the average individual. So think about somebody else when you're reading the pamphlet. And we saw similar effects. So, no, it's okay. You can get over here. So, mortality salience causes generally a worldview defense, or maybe I should back up and say what mortality. Do you guys know what? Define the mortality salience manipulation. So we're, huh? Define it, yeah. You guys can, they can talk, right? I mean, throw things. I'm like not used to like all this politeness. It's very disconcerting. So mortality salience is a standard manipulation. We used to there's various forms of it in the literature, but basically the form we used is what we thought was the most standard form, where you say to people in the experimental condition, please imagine and write out for us what you think happens to your body, or will happen to your body. See, even I can't like really admit it. Will happen to your body once you die and you're physically dead. And people write about rotting in the coffin and all sorts of nice stuff. And the point of this is to remind people that they're mortal. So we all, at some level know that we must be, but seem to run around living our lives without really letting that information in very much. And we compared it to a standard control group situation where instead of saying nothing, we say, tell us what happens when you're experiencing dental pain. So you're in the dentist chair and you're getting a cavity filled or something, whatever the standard text was we used. And so the idea is it's matched to something, the dental pain is matched to mortality salience in that you're focused on your own body, you're focused on something unpleasant. They claim it's not, the authors that are experts on mortality salience claim it's not a stress manipulation. that claim is usually based on a null result where they don't find stress moving, and we don't find stress moving, but you know, for what it's worth, it's standard manipulation. It's not supposed to be stress. I'm still not sure I completely believe that, but I'm okay with it if it's even stress. So mortality salience does all sorts of things. There's an interesting little paper a few years ago that shows, that basically showed mortality salience made people like George Bush after 9/11, because they made them like people who say, our country is the best country, and you know, so explain some things. One of the things mortality salience does is it seems to create a consensus mechanism. It seems to put us in this sort of mindset where acknowledging our own mortality, we kind of cling to the importance of our own culture and our own beliefs and our own worldviews. So we're more likely to extend our worldview to others. And internal health locus of control is in part a worldview. It's related to the just world hypothesis, this idea that people get what they deserve and people deserve what they get and things are controllable. The other side of it is, hey, things are random, stuff happens, you know, and so we think that what we're going to get with mortality salience is this consensus mechanism to happen where mortality salience increases the degree to which you implicitly, I don't think this is very explicit, but implicitly assume and think that others are like you and share your worldview, share your beliefs. So, what do we do in this experiment? Well, our main dependent variable is prevention DB. So we ask 5 or 6 items, things like, are you going to use condoms next time you have a sexual encounter? And these were college undergrads, and we had, you know, we didn't want to be too personal, but we took some demographic things to try to, you know, control for natural variability in behavior. None of our undergrads were married. When we used the internet sample, we got adults who were single. So with this prevention-dependent variable, and that's really what we care about is, look, intentions, and this is, as I said up front, these are intentions. Intentions to do the stuff that the pamphlet and the CDC website and anybody else will tell you to do if you look at it. You know, use condoms, be choosy in terms of sexual partners, a bunch of stuff like that. And what we expected was, first of all, health locus of control at baseline, so baseline here is under the dental pain condition, should increase prevention. And that's the effect that's in the literature. And to the degree that we found any debate in the literature, the debate was how strong is the effect, or is it really there? Sometimes some people would find a positive effect for internal health locus of control, and then maybe another study wouldn't find a significant effect. But that's basically the baseline. That's not particularly news. Okay. The second bullet point is really our hypothesis, and that is that the effect of internal health locus of control would dampen or reverse under mortality salience. And so the idea is it would cause an extension of your own worldview to others. Well, if others can control their risks, there's probably not much risk out there in the world. You know, and honestly, with HIV, it's kind of debatable. I mean, the undergrads are pretty scared of it, but the incidence is actually pretty low. So, not that I'm saying HIV-free prevention is a good thing, so I'm not saying it's not. But, so we thought if mortality salience caused an extension of people's worldview to others, this could undermine the benefit of internal health locus of control. We also measured risks. And based on this mechanism, this mechanism suggests we can make a prediction about risk. So remember, what we say is happening essentially with mortality salience is it causes me as the participant to extend my view to others, right? So we don't think self-risk is going to be changed. It doesn't change how you think about yourself, right? It changes the degree to which you think everybody else is like you. So what we expected was self-risk shouldn't be changed by mortality salience. Other risk should move more towards baseline self-risk under mortality salience. Other risk should move towards the self-risk. Sure, yeah.
The last part of that prevention DB is the extension of worldview to others, leading to some sort of decrease in exercise of internal locus of control?
No, what we measure, what we think is that, what we find, what we measure, like what we don't know, I know what's on the slide, so what we actually find is a reversal, and the reversal is on the prevention DB. So the idea is, so we think what's being dampened is not the belief in an internal health locus of control. That's actually not affected by mortality science, but the degree to which you need to prevent. You feel the need to prevent. And our story is, our mechanism is that mortality salience causes you to think about other people like you. And then, now again, now I'm filling in the gaps here, and then to think something like, well, they're all prevented too, so I don't need to worry.
So that's actually what I was asking. Has other literature found that extension of that worldview to others, it does cause people to change their behaviors? Like, oh, other people are doing it, so I don't have to.
I don't think this. I don't think people have found this particular fact. I don't know that anybody's particularly looked for it, but I think that's where our contribution is, and I think we couldn't really find anything where internal health locus of control was negatively associated with prevention, and that's what I'll show you here. So that's what I think you're zeroing in on what's new. Ms. Pickard, yeah.
Go on kind of what Barbara was saying. You think there might be like a modeling effect that everyone's doing it, I should do it.
Yes, you can imagine it the other way too. That's right. Yeah, if everybody's doing it. I think what we have at baseline is I'm thinking I should do it because I'm kind of better, and you do find, like, not as much strongly in our data, but in other work, there seems to be a really big, across a whole bunch of health risks, so we haven't really been looking at this, a really big unrealistic optimism effect for internal health locus of control. So a baseline internals kind of think, well, I do the good stuff, but other people might not, so my risk is way lower. And it's called unrealistic optimism. It's not even clear it's unrealistic because these guys engage in more prevention. But you're right. You could imagine a modeling, type of thing. The thing that we want to do, what we want to get to eventually, and we don't have it here, but that I think we should get to your point, is look at these kind of mechanisms for contagious diseases where we think the story holds, and then also for non-contagious diseases. So for a disease like getting mammograms with breast cancer or something, where there's no contagion effect, this mechanism should be shut down, and maybe you can get only modeling. So that's a way we could tease those apart. But we haven't done it yet. We'll do it, I don't know, 4 years from now. I think we'll do it next year, so 4 years from now we'll do it. Okay. All right. So, here we use graduate and undergrad students came into the lab. And so we have two independent variables. Measured locus of control. We actually measured it after the manipulation. There's no effect of the manipulation on it. Really, we should have counterbalanced measuring it before and after. But we measured it at the very end, actually with a pretty big gap. We even had another study thrown in there. So we measured locus of control. And it's always internal health locus of control, and I think I neglected to put the site up there, but it's a well-cited scale. There's lots of papers in health, generally in the journal Health Psychology, that use this scale. It's pretty well validated. There's all various versions of it, pretty well validated. And actually, when I'm on the scale, there's actually 3 pieces to the scale. So there's internal versus external health locus of control, which is what I'm going to show you. Is basically the internal items minus the external items. There's also items for physician locus of control, doctor locus of control. So there's items like, does my doctor control whether I can be well when I'm sick? And those don't do anything in our study, and we did measure them, but we didn't really expect them to do anything because, once you're under treatment for HIV, it's too late, bluntly. So, we think in this particular context, what's relevant is really the degree to which you think the participant thinks HIV is controllable by the individual versus just due to chance, it's just luck, stuff happens, and that the physician just isn't important for the behaviors we're asking. All right, and then the standard mortality salience manipulation. When I have an example of one of our prevention intention items, please write your intent to use a condom in your next sexual encounter. And obviously obviously these guys are all saying, those intentions are all pretty high. We've got social desirability going on here. Of course, we've also got results, so they're moving around too. And then for risk assessment, assessment. We asked them how likely do you think the average individual might be to contract HIV in the next 10 years, and also how likely do you think you might be to contract HIV in the next 10 years. So we measured both assessments. And I'll just show you these items for a minute. Actually, since I did these slides, Adriana reran, well, let me step back and I'll tell you. So when we first looked at these items, 1 through 11 are the standard internal versus external items. But when we first did the alpha and looked at the scale, the items 5 through 7 that are kind of in blue, they didn't load very well with the rest of the items. And so we dropped them out of the measure. Actually, subsequently, Adriana reran all this stuff. She's very energetic. She's really good. Reran all this stuff with all the items, and we still get the same results, but the alpha's crappy, so I don't know what to do. It's a standard scale, but and if you, the reason I put this up here is because I think it's interesting to look at the items, and I think particularly.
Did you do a separate analysis altogether, a separate factor analysis disregarding all previously validated measures, and just seeing whether you had different loadings? So, for example.
Yeah, whether they load. I think actually when you do that, they all do go on the same factor. But then when you do the alpha, it's like low. I mean, it's just those items aren't. So, so I can't decide. Like I can't decide what I don't think we have 2 factors in here. I think like particularly item 6. Like I can only do what my doctor tells me to do. Well, it's probably not as relevant in this context, and they were thinking about HIV. I mean, that might load more with the doctory items. So I don't know. I thought it mattered, but it actually doesn't really matter that much. So, but you can kind of see the items like people who never get sick are just plain lucky. Now, none of these items are about HIV, right? They're your worldview about basically are diseases caused internally, but your own internal means your own behavior, right? Not like your heart, internal, I realize sounds like, cellular, that. Or is it just luck? Is it just, it just happens, when your number's up type of thinking, and your behavior doesn't determine your outcomes. And you can see, if I take care of myself, I can avoid illness. That's an internal item versus people who never get sick or just plain lucky. That's on the external side of the scale. Okay, generalized belief. And basically what we find is what we think are 2 interesting interactions. Well, I'll start with the middle here. Self-risk doesn't move. So we do something with mortality salience. It doesn't move people's own self-risks. That's not moving. So it's not as if by reminding them they're going to die someday, we make them just, feel more at risk for HIV across the board or something. It's a little more subtle than that. What we find are what we think are 2 very interesting interactions for prevention and for other risk. And essentially, what we find is that the effect of internal health locus of control depends on the level of mortality salience. Okay, so I'm going to decompose these interactions for you and show you. I'll do prevention first, and then other risk, which we think is some of the sort of backup story. So these are estimated means. So what we did is regressions, and these are means of prevention intention estimated at 1.5. You can do it at 1, but it looks prettier at 1.5. At 1.5, since the X looks better on the screen. Standard deviations for internal health look. At 1.5 is pushing it, because I admit, so you do it at 1.5, and these 2 variables, they're 3 standard deviations away from each other. But I didn't like them at 1. They just look like little X's. All right, so you see what we're doing here. We're taking internal health locus of control estimated at 1.5 standard deviations below the mean for external, above the mean for internal, and then estimating prevention intentions. In the dental pain condition, the slope there is significant, the simple slope is significant, and we get basically what you would expect based on the literature. You would expect any effective internal health locus of control is that people who are higher on locus of control report more prevention behaviors. Right? Does that make sense? All that, and that's, I guess, I think that's easiest to understand if you think of the other side. I mean, if it's just random, what's the point of preventing, right? If you're low, it undermines your prevention. surprise left, and right, well, now what am I going to show you, right? I'm not going to show you that line again. But what we find for mortality salience is, in fact, a significant reversal. And honestly, you know, I don't think we particularly expected a reversal. I think we expected it to be dampened, but, I mean, I know we expected it to be dampened. We were delighted. We thought it was really interesting we got the reversal. So, under mortality salience, internal health locus of control, and this is like a pretty good X here, it's basically undermining prevention. For some reason, they're telling us, these guys who are higher on internal locus of control are telling us, condoms not so much, not so important. I mean, everybody's like, it's an 11-point scale, everybody's near the top. Like, nobody's admitting 0, they're all the way at the bottom. And by the way, we look for outliers on either side, and this does not seem to be an outlier-driven story. We don't get lots of 0s, we don't get lots of 11s. And again, what we think is happening with mortality salience is essentially across the board, it's this extension of the worldview. That the internal health locus of control guys are kind of going, yeah, well, this thing's controllable. I mean, you know, if everybody's kind of careful, I mean, you know, I don't have to be vigilant on my own, right? It's not all up to me. So I can kind of relax a little. Conversely, the external guys who think about health, well, it's just random. You know, if they extend that, I think the natural extension is something like, it's just random, anybody could have HIV. Geez, I better be careful. You know, all of a sudden, these guys are motivated to be careful because I think it's more natural to them, under mortality salience, to think about the fact that every single person is under some risk and can have some unexpected consequences. All right. So we investigate other risk. Risk is sort of a partial explanation. I say partial because, you know, there's some leaps between these variables. I don't have this really tight story from other risk changes this belief, which changes that belief, which changes prevention. It'd be cool if I did that. But here's what I do have, is a similar pattern. So if you look at, or, you know, really the converse pattern. So if you look at others' risks, and remember, self-risks are flat. If you look at others' risk, at baseline, people who are internal and health locus of control think other people are at more risk. Right? So they're, and I think that's where I think they have this sort of story that, well, I'm careful, but those other guys aren't. So, you know, and that maybe even some of their prevention is coming from this idea that, well, I know I'm vigilant and I'm good, but that's essentially what sets me apart. I'm at less risk than these other people, and they think they're at less risk. And what mortality salience does is basically flattens that. So we don't have the reversal, but we have a flattening. That under mortality salience, basically what happens is the degree to which internals see others as at increased risk is dampened, kind of comes down. And so we think this is interesting. We did some path models, and I'll try to go through them quickly. It's not, we tried to look for like a moderated mediation thing, but it's not exactly that. We've got some marginal effects. But I think the story is emerging a bit. Is that basically what we have here is I have the betas for models where we just essentially separate the data into the dental pain condition and the mortality salience condition, okay? So the top panel is dental pain, that's our baseline. And basically what we find is internal health locus of control makes people think that others are at risk. To the degree they think that others are at risk, they prevent more. So that's where I'm getting this sort of story where you go, well, I'm kind of judgmental of others. I think that there's likely risks out there, perhaps because I think other people aren't as careful as I am, so I better prevent. You know, I better redouble my efforts to prevent. In fact, if you do a mediation analysis on this subset of the data and do a combined model, the effective internal health locus of control becomes non-significant. So other risk mediates the effects of control on prevention. I have to say marginally because the effective locus of control on other risks is p less than 0.07. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good story. I mean, I think this is the story that data are telling here. And essentially what happens with mortality salience is it breaks that step between locus of control and others' risk. Doesn't break the relationship between others' risk and prevention. Still, to the degree I think that others are at risk, I prevent more. But it breaks that step where and we think it's breaking it by causing an extension of the internal's worldview to all those other people out there, and so bringing their risk, that other estimated other risk, towards their own individual baseline. All right, extension of own world. I think I've said all this already. We postulate that mortality standards cause an extension of one's own worldview to the others. More generally, we're finding that prevention intentions for HIV are influenced by assessment of other risks. We don't think this is so much an unrealistic optimism story across the board. We just don't find that much unrealistic optimism in these data. We're going to find more in the next study, actually. Here, for whatever reason, how we set it up, others are at more risk, a little bit more risk on average, but not much more. But particularly where others are at more risk is in the dental pain, internal condition, the internal. So if I plot unrealistic optimism, I get a pattern that looks, well, I'll show you what it looks like. It looks just like this, because self-risk is flat and other risk is moving. But I don't think it's an unrealistic optimism story here. I think it's just plain other risk moving story. Okay. Study one suggests that the benefits to internal locus of control at baseline might be driven by a distinction for self and others made for these internals. And there's some previous work that I've already talked about that suggests that might generally be the case. So here in study 2, what we want to do is a couple things. One, test our mechanism without the voodoo of mortality salience, because who knows what's really going on there. I mean, I guess people think they do, but I'm not sure I know exactly what's going on with mortality salience. So I want to try to use a very different manipulation and see if I get the same effect. And also, we're going to look more at unrealistic optimism here. We're going to carefully either focus people on others' risk and then self-risk, or self-risk and then others' risk, and look at whether these distinctions between self and other risk are important, what the pattern is. Study 2, again, we measure locus of control, internal health locus of control, and we have a manipulation of perspective, self or other. And we think, as I said, we think the self perspective is really just a baseline. But instead of just doing nothing and then having people think about others, we matched the manipulation conditions more carefully. So, everybody essentially got the same directions up front. Think about a person while you're reading this pamphlet, which hadn't been done in the first study. But then, instead of a person, we said either yourself or the average individual. And we expect the self-perspective to replicate that baseline positive relationship between locus of control and prevention, essentially replicate the dental pain condition in study 1.
Can I ask a question, please?
Sure, yeah.
Especially given the subject that you're looking at here, HIV and all that, and something which is so much important in so many other global areas, how would the self-perspective predictions change if you look at it in terms of a group of people as opposed to a collective society?
Oh, yeah, that could be different. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think this, and I'm not that deep of an expert on, I'm not an expert at all, on internal health locus of control, really, but I wonder if it's an individual. I don't know if somebody's looked at how that interrelates with collectivism. I'll bet it matters. I'll bet individualists are more internal, I would think. So I don't have sharp hypotheses for you, but I bet it would matter. We did collect ethnicity. We have so we have Duke University subjects basically in study 1. Study 2, we used the Qualtrics panel, and I think only in the U.S. We did for some of these risks. We did the self versus other, and then we took a bunch of measures at the end where we tried to say imagine risks for yourself, and then your best friend, and then the average person in a European city, and then, to try to get it. But we just basically got kind of this gradient. But that's really to ask them to think about other people, which is not what you were asking. You were asking, how would this change if you were using more collective individuals? I'll bet it would be different, because I think this is really about thinking about how I'm different from these others. And I hadn't thought through much how I would, or at all, until you said, how I think it would change. But I bet it might. Bet it would. So in this other perspective, we say, we thought a lot about, now I'm embarrassed because I forget exactly what we said. I think we said the average, so this is an internet, so the average American individual your age or something. I mean, we didn't want them thinking about like potential sexual partners, or, we wanted it to really be other, not some extension of self thing. But then we were also worried, like globally HIV risk really changes. So we did like the average person of your age, the average American your age, something like that. I should have put it on the slides because I can't remember it. But we asked them to, think about another person when they were reading it. And what we expected is, again, if you extend your worldview to others, I mean, the idea we had was that when you think about this other person, how do you think about them? When we ask you to like estimate, do other people eat hot dogs? What predicts whether you think other people eat hot dogs? Whether you eat hot dogs. So people who eat hot dogs think households, hot dog consumption is a lot higher. Okay, that's really trivial. But the point is, how do you think about another person? Well, you tend to anchor on your own beliefs. You got your own psychology. So the idea is we thought that this, again, would cause this extension of worldview, that when they were thinking about the average other, they were going to either, if they're internal, think, oh, this average person, they're going to be really concerned, they're going to prevent. Whereas if you were external, you're going to think, oh, wow, who knows whether this average person's going to get it, who can't control it, who, wow, it would be really stinky if they got HIV. And, stuff happens type of mindset. And so so that's what we thought would happen with prevention across the two conditions. And then we thought by focusing people on the self, we might exacerbate this unrealistic optimism, because that's happened before, and that taking the other perspective would minimize unrealistic optimism. And what I mean by unrealistic optimism is essentially the absolute value of the difference between, no, sorry, not the absolute value, the value of the difference between self-risk minus other risk. No, that would be negative. Other risk minus self-risk. The degree to which you think others are at more risk than you are. Other risk minus self-risk. Sorry about that. Okay. All right, what reading? Okay, and then the other thing we did as part of the manipulation, so we confounded two aspects of the manipulation. I've already told you about the instructions for the pamphlet, and we also, I alluded to this, but I don't think I really made it explicit, is we also manipulated question order. So if you were self-focused, we asked your risk, your prevention, and then kind of by the way, and how a risk is the average other person. In the other condition, we asked the other risk, then your prevention. And what we're trying to do is accentuate the degree to which prevention is considered from the context of your own risk versus from the context of other risk. Now, normatively, I mean, you get HIV from other people, so they're both always relevant. But we thought internal health, right? You can't get it from a toilet seat, right? That we thought internal health, locus of control would have different effects. So measured as before, internet sample of single individuals ages 18 to 35. And it's just so we also we put main effect covariates for with this risk question at the very end that it's basically Adriana very carefully worded it. It kind of says something along the lines of have you never never ever done anything that might expose you to HIV. You know, so some people just don't have the variability in behavior that other people have, and we didn't want to get into asking about like all sorts of details because we thought IRB would go nuts, and we really didn't want to know. Especially when we're using like like 20-year-old undergrads, we just couldn't stand it. But we had this sort of subtle risk question that we had some variability on. I think and so we control for that. That's all we control for in study 1. In study 2, we control for age and education too, because they just varied a lot in this internet sample, and that sucked up some variance for us. And so here I'm giving you 4 DVs, and again I'll start in the middle where things aren't moving. So basically, neither self nor other risk moves very much, but the difference between them moves. So if you look at either of them, you don't get much of a story, but if you look at the difference score, that's where the story is for risk here. But more importantly, I think, is prevention, and we get this similar to study 1, similar interaction for prevention in that the impact of health locus of control on prevention intentions differs depending on the focal individual. So again, plotting at 1.5 standard deviations for internal health locus of control. Again, at the self-first baseline, internal locus of control looks like a good thing here. It's generally considered a good thing in the literature. Causes people to indicate higher prevention intentions. And again, and now here this is even stronger just in magnitude than the first study. We find that when you think of others, internal health locus of control undermines intentions. So you think of the average individual, you read about HIV risk, you don't read about sunshine and beaches. But then you're less likely, if you're internal, to say you would use condoms. And by the way, these contrasts within internal are significant as well. So we're really getting them to drop. Okay, so this, oh yeah, we got the scale screwy. This is why I couldn't remember this before. So I'm also going to show you optimism here. I think we scaled this a stupid way. I don't know. So we have self minus other. So negative numbers mean you're more optimistic, right? So we see at baseline, the internal guys are more optimistic, right? They're arguing about optimistic because they think the average other person is at more risk than they are. And that's a significant slope. And that slope essentially is flattened. It looks like it reverses a little, but it's flattened under other focus. So like mortality science, what other focus seems to do is bring self and other risks together. Erode this distinction that internals feel between their own individual risk and the average individual's risk. Self and other risk both move slightly here, so those effects are not significant individually, but when you look at the difference, it moves. And really, honestly, here, the thing I would love to have that we don't have is any of these sort of path effects that I showed you in that first study. And I honestly don't know if it's a power issue or if it's just something else that's driving both risk and prevention. But we don't find tight relationships between even other risk and prevention here, finding some conditions. So that's that. So we think what we find in study 2 is that we've been able to generalize the study 1's effects. I think I've already said this 8 times, so I won't say it to you again. So the other thing we think is interesting about study 2 is we're getting unrealistic optimism within an HIV setting of HIV risk. And we think that's important in general. And we find in study 2, unrealistic optimism seems to be associated with internal health locus of control, but actually thinking about the other person seems to reduce that. But the way it seems to reduce that is in a way, it is at least in part, thinking that the other person's at less risk, right? The self and other risks come together, and at this, move closer together. And at the same time, these people are saying, well, I have lower intentions to use condoms and be careful than I did before I thought about this other person. So it's not clear it's a particularly good thing that's going on when this unrealistic optimism is flattened here. So some of our implications, why we think this is interesting and important. We think we're finding a downside to internal health locus of control. And we think when we sit back, it makes sense. I mean, if health risks are really that controllable, then maybe you don't need to worry about them, right? So probably the ideal cognitive state is to think that you can control your own risk for contagious diseases, but nobody else can control their risk, so you can't rely on those others, you've got to rely on yourself. And more generally, there's a lot of work. I'm interested in emotion and coping, and there's a lot of work in the emotion literature, or the coping literature, that looks at control, and the bottom line is basically, generally control is good, right? Generally believing you're in control leads to good things, but not always, and Folkman has an interesting piece on this. So for instance, if you're in a situation that just objectively stinks, feeling you're in control of it is not such a good thing. I work on this grant through Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, where we're looking at informed consent, so come back around to control, I promise. We're looking at informed consent in research, and we're looking at parents of children who have cancer, who are, and generally it's a recurrence because they're at Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, they come from all over, and most of the treatment is done on clinical trials. So most of the parents are consenting to put their children on a clinical trial. And most of the clinical trials are of the form of one arm is the standard of care, one arm is the standard of care plus some little thing we think helps. I mean, they're not like giving any of these kids zero treatment. But still, so they choose to be on a clinical trial, and we did a bunch of focus groups, and then we're doing some surveys. And we say to these parents, did you decide, first we started by saying to them, we want to talk about your decision to put your kid on this clinical trial. And a good bit of them at that step stop us and say, I didn't decide this. I didn't decide for my kid to have cancer. Right? So there's this tension where, ethically for IRB, ethically you want to say the parent is in control, the parent has to understand that the parent is in control. Otherwise you got no business putting a kid on a clinical trial. But when you talk to the parents, this is like, the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And they don't want to be in control of it, they don't want to hear they're in control of it. A good bit of them are saying, we just want to do what the doctor says. And so they realize they sign the form. I don't think there's an IRB problem there, but I think there's a coping problem there, where in retrospect, when you frame the child's treatment decisions as under the control of the parent, which ethically, legally, morally, they absolutely are under the control of the parent, there's some downsides to that, there's some costs to that. So that's certainly not what we're getting here, but the similarities that I think are interesting is, across these very disparate literatures, there's this dominant theme that control is good, and I'm certainly not arguing against that, right? I'm not arguing about people being in control of their own medical care, and I'm not arguing about internal health locus of control generally being a good thing. But there are some downsides to control. You can perhaps estimate that your control is greater than it is, and then take risks you shouldn't take, which I think is what we're getting here. And you can also feel responsible for things that you don't want to be responsible for. Yeah?
I just want to ask a question, somewhat related to the earlier one, and also related to what you were just saying. Going back to the first experiment, would you speculate that it's possible that individuals, all of us, given a choice, not so much in manipulation, but given a choice, would almost always socialize the risk and try to get someone else to assume some of the responsibility for it and evade the individual responsibilities out of it? I mean, it's kind of dissonance reduction.
Yeah.
To think, well, this person's like me, it's right?
Right. I think that's right. I think that's a natural, so that you would one-page pamphlet that is kind of surprising that I think these are pretty big effects for, just a perspective taking, and I think that the reason that we get these effects it probably has to do with what you're suggesting, which is it's kind of nice to assume that other people are shouldering the burden of responsibility. There's something kind of freeing about that.
And perhaps even basic in us somehow driving us that way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it sounds, and that's kind of why I know it's not directly related. It's kind of why I brought up that the work on informed consent is that, I was surprised by how powerful some of these reactions were. I mean, some people, I just heard the tapes, but some people were mad that, that the interviewer was suggesting that they had individual control, and there clearly was this very deep need to believe somebody else was shouldering the burden of the responsibility and the risk. And reasonably in that case, right? Reasonably, they want to believe that the doctors, first of all, the doctors know more, they went to the hospital for the doctors to take care of their child. So that's perfectly reasonable. In this condition, I mean, if everybody thinks somebody else is worrying about HIV, then we got a public health problem, right? Because that means somebody's worrying about it. So this need might be problematic. I forgot where we're at. Oh, okay. And one thing that I think is an implication of our work that we weren't, when we first started thinking about it, we were kind of thinking about, HIV versus cancer. We were thinking that they were all, that internal health, locus of control, we have similar effects across all of these conditions. And I mean, it may be that other people get the distinction and I missed it, but a lot of the health psych stuff, at least on internal health, locus of control, doesn't seem to, seems to make the error that in retrospect I think we made initially, which is not really recognizing that the nature of risk is very different. The cognitive aspects of risk and even the emotional aspects of risk are very different from something that's a contagious disease versus not a contagious disease. I think that's just an interesting lens through which to look at health psychology. Now, I don't have non-contagious conditions here, but again, that's something we'd be interested in looking at. And then message framing itself might account for some of the variations in strength of internal health, locus of control, and locus of control effects on prevention. So some studies show very strong positive effects for either internal health, locus of control, or just more generalized locus of control, which is just a general worldview. And other studies show dampening effects. We don't know any studies that show the reversal, but other studies show dampening effects, and we think maybe part of the reason in some studies the effects are dampened is because the materials or the context makes people think more about others, and that might erode some of the benefits. Let me see what, we've got a couple minutes, I think. So, oops, I thought I had a future work. Did I get it? There was one. Okay, so what do we plan to do next? All right. This is what we think we'll do next. So, one thing is we're trying to decide what to do with this paper. And depending on what we send, we might, for reasons none of you probably care about, but if we send, we might think about sending it to the Journal of Consumer Research, and if we do that, we know somebody's going to make us manipulate control. They're going to say, we don't like individual difference variables, which is a stupid thing I say. So one of the things, cut that on tape, right? One of the things that so if we go that route, what we're going to try to do is manipulate control. So that replace the internal health locus of control in these models I showed you with a manipulation. And we tried one study doing that, and basically our manipulation failed. We tried to manipulate the degree to which diabetes was seen as controllable versus not by essentially either talking about type 1 or type 2, but which are, one's controllable through diet and exercise and stuff. I guess they all can be treated that way, but one is genetic and one is lifestyle, but nobody bought it. Our undergrads didn't buy it. I think they thought everything was controllable. And I think that points to a problem. I think it's actually very hard to mess around with people's belief about what's controllable in life. But we could probably find some context where we could do it. And then the other thing we want to do next, one thing we're just working on right now is a more exploratory study where we look at a bunch of different diseases varying in contagion or contagiousness and try to look at the strength of the relationships between self-risk and then importantly other risk and prevention across those various disease conditions to try to flesh out what I alluded to is I think is this important contingency about whether things are contagious or not. So that's it. So a few minutes for questions.
This idea is still forming in my head, so I apologize if this is going to sound really strange. I'm just going to spout it out.
Okay, I'll try to keep up.
Yeah. So I was thinking, if you suggest to somebody to think about others, I'm thinking that might, cue them in to pay more attention to, ideas like prevalence rates,
Yeah.
which might, mess with their idea of the likelihood, things happening, might, bring some fear in, and that might be driving, these differences between self and others. Given your stimuli, is that even a possibility, or would that even matter?
I don't think I should have done a slide with the pamphlet, and I didn't. I don't think we give them numbers on prevalence. I mean, I don't know. I think there's a lot of things that can happen. I think people are certainly much more willing to admit that somebody else might have HIV than that they have it, right? So I think I see where you're going. That maybe thinking about the others, generates more fear, generates more attention to the prevalence or lack thereof. We measured fear and it didn't move, but that's not a great defense because maybe we had a crappy measure. I mean, we probably did. And we didn't tell them the prevalence because we thought it was too low. I mean, if you really look at the prevalence on college campuses, it's pretty low. So we didn't tell them the prevalence, but they may very well know it. The reason we picked HIV is that Duke had, the Duke Student Health Center is just really big on HIV screening, and they have all these HIV, posters and stuff, and we did this just general pretest, and we asked the undergrads what health risks they're worried about, and HIV came up a lot. But that doesn't, so I don't know. I mean, I don't, our pamphlet was more about the impact of HIV and then prevention, but there's a lot of attitudinal and belief variables that would underlie HIV prevention, and we didn't measure all of those. So I don't know if some of those other intervening variables. Okay.
Seems to me that HPV would be an awful
Oh, that's a good
area
one.
to be working for you guys to be working. First of all, it's relatively new.
Yeah. In fact, we have studies with HPV. We're doing some with that.
And are you doing this kind?
We're doing this kind. Well, we actually just did. We're trying to. We have internal health locus of control, and we haven't done the self or other thing, but we could. But yeah, HPV is like a new source of stimuli.
Well, it is.
So I agree. I mean, I agree with you. I don't know that we've completely unpacked it, but it's sexually transmitted. Well, we've done with HPV stimuli. We've used only female subjects for.
Which is a mistake.
You think it's a mistake? What to use only? Well, because women are the ones that get the cervical
Whether it has
cancer.
trans-
They get it from men. Yeah. So you could look at. So you guys know about HPV, Gardasil, and all. Yeah, it's an interesting. I teach healthcare marketing. It's a very interesting marketing case.
Because there's some speculation that as people begin to assume that everybody else is using this, because it was a pretty big introductory success.
Right.
So-
Right. Gardasil. Yeah.
Gardasil. People
So-
start assuming everybody else is taking Gardasil, so why do I need it?
Why do I
Because
need it?
the-
Yeah.
The guy that I'm with was with somebody who already had Gardasil.
Right. No, I agree. It's an interesting. We did one study where we actually were trying to manipulate prevalence. We were trying to use HPV to manipulate vulnerability instead of just measuring it. And so, basically there's all these strains of HPV. So we either told people about 2 strains and said, you know, there's a 4% chance you have it, or told them about a set of strains and said there's a 20% chance. And what we got is when we asked people how worried they were and how much risk they were under and stuff, we got this crazy reversal that the 4% people felt like they were at more risk. And I think what happened is when we said we picked out a set of strains that were at about 20% prevalence in the population, and I think when we told women about those strains, we just got like total defensiveness and denial. And yeah, we just shut them down. So we're still working out the stimuli. Whereas this one, I think they were like engaged with us because the prevalence is actually pretty low. But anyway, I agree. I don't have much to say about it, but I agree that HPV is an interesting contacts, and I've kind of been watching like the Gardasil marketing, and the Merck is actually in the process. Merck is the company that makes Gardasil. They're in the process of trying to get approval for HPV for boys. For Gardasil, for the Gardasil for HPV. They're trying to get the virus. They're trying to get approval for boys, but then they're going to have this interesting marketing situation that they've marketed it as a cervical cancer vaccine. Which is why we started with female subjects. You know, they marketed it as a cervical cancer vaccine, which it is, but not as a sexually transmitted disease vaccine, which it also is. So it's really, and if you think about like, should boys get it, you have just a lot of very interesting contagion type problems and situations. So I agree, it's like a totally interesting. It's like makes HIV boring. We all know about HIV.